quick question. I left you with this last time, but if a machine like the Turing machine, if that machine can talk like you, and it can argue like you, and it can joke like you, at what point do you owe it the assumption that it has a mind? So that's part of what we're going to be tackling today. At what point could this machine here do enough where you would take a look at it and say, you know what? I know it's mechanical. I know it's a physical symbol system. It's not organic, but I have to say, based on what it can do, that it must have a mind. At what point would you be willing to make that assertion? So this was our way of tackling the importance of the Turing machine. So last time we introduced this idea that that machine right there that you can actually make, it's not theoretical. It's a physically realizable machine, physically realizable system called a Turing machine. Well, Alan Turing proved, again, not hypothesized, not surmised, but proved that given enough time and given enough tape, that Turing machine can perform any computational task. And as we've seen, if we think about cognition as being symbol manipulation in computational terms, which is what cognitive psychology does, well, then that means that it can do any cognitive task. So if any cognitive task can be implemented in a Turing machine, the question I left you with last time was how much needs to be implemented for us to say that that machine has mentality, for us to say that that machine is actually thinking, it actually has a mind. So that's what we're going to do when we're talking about mentality. We mean how much before you would say that that machine has a mind. So I gave you that scenario about you being in charge of a startup company that was trying to develop a general intelligence AI program, and your team kept coming back with you and saying, well, it can do this, and it can do this, and it can do this. And the question was, at what point would you say, hey, you know what, you've done it, that has a mind, you've created a mind. So the thing about this is that we're looking for that sufficient condition for mentality. When is it enough, or when can this machine do enough for you to say that it has a mind? And one of the things to know is that absolutely no one has a perfect answer for this. So there is no universally agreed upon answer for this that is locked in, dead set. So what I'm asking you to talk about today is, what was your threshold that you came up with? Or what was your way of saying, yes, that's enough for a machine for you to say, yeah, that thing is thinking, yes, it has a mind. Mm-hmm.
I think it would need autonomy, wants, and emotion.
So you're saying autonomy, wants, and emotion? So autonomy meaning?
It can exist without the existence of prompts to guide it somewhere.
Okay, so autonomy, it has to be able to act on its own. So it's not just waiting for input. It can actually, of its own volition, do cognition on its own. What was the next one? Wants. So it has desires, it has its own goals. So it hasn't been told necessarily what to do, but it has its own goals.
Something that doesn't necessarily need to survive, but just wants.
Oh, okay. So not something necessary for survival, but just something superfluous that it just for some reason wants to accumulate and wants to have. Okay, and what was the last one? Emotion. So we have autonomy, we have wants, and we have emotions. Anybody? And if it had those three things, you would tell your team that they're finished? Yeah? Okay. Any other ideas? Does anybody want to counter that, or can anybody think of a thing that has autonomy, has wants, and has emotions, but you would not want to say that it has a mind? Can anybody come up with a counterexample? All right. Well, it seems like you won them over. It's a pretty tight definition. Nicely done. So, was there any other kind of abilities that you would require for the machine to have, for you to consider that it has general thinking, it has mentality? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, in order to measure if it has that stuff, probably the ability to communicate properly.
Okay. So,
Most AIs already have, output.
okay. So we have the ability to communicate properly. So, what do you mean by communicate properly?
Like, if it has cognition and it has its own wants and desires, being able to express that. Because if a machine was able to reach cognition but could only ever answer the prompts it was given to the specifications, then
Mhm.
it wouldn't be able to be recognized as general intelligence possibly.
Okay, so that's a very interesting point that you just brought up about if a thing, if a machine was able to do cognition, but could not communicate that other than people, kind of getting an output, or let's just strip it down to the basics. If it wasn't able to communicate that, then what you said kind of seemed like it would have a mind, but you just wouldn't know it. You wouldn't have any evidence of it. Fair? Okay. All right. Any other things to add? Was there anybody who thought to themselves, it doesn't matter what this machine can do, I would not be willing to say that machine had a mind? Okay. Well, those were some really good suggestions. They were some really interesting suggestions, especially considering the time that we're in right now. So we're going to see what Turing came up with. I believe this was back in the 40s. So imagine this was 80 years ago, and he was speculating at that time if we ever do build that Turing machine. I think this was pre-miniaturization. So he was probably thinking, if we ever do build that Turing machine that is the size of a city and has just thousands upon thousands of miles of tape, we could finally do general intelligence. The way that he came up with determining if something had general intelligence was called the Turing test. So what the Turing test was, it was the idea, and it was a very, very kind of subtle switch that he did, but it was based on the idea, first off, that we know that we have minds. And what I mean by we, I mean I know that I have a mind. And you know that you have a mind. And we know that because of a little thing that we can do called introspection. So if you start thinking to yourself, do I actually have a mind? You can sit there and look into your own mind, introspect, and say to yourself, you know what? Yeah, I guess I do. I have a mind. And this is basically what Rene Descartes started with his famous "I think, therefore I am" declaration. So we can know that we're thinking. We can know that we have a mind. And again, I'll put that in very stricter terms. I can know that I have a mind because I can introspect and I can take a look into my own thoughts and say, yes, I am thinking. I think, therefore I am. I have a mind. But, and it's a big but, we actually only believe that other people, other human beings have minds. And the reason for that is that there is no such thing as extrospection. There's no such thing as being able to look into another person's mind and actually see it. And you could tell that by our discussions in the beginning of what the mind is. We're not even really sure what we're looking for. So, how could we ever see it if we don't even know what it is? But we know ourselves. I know for myself, I have a mind, but I have no basis for that assumption for anybody else that I ever came into contact with. So everybody else that I ever have come into contact with, I have no good evidence that they, or no absolute evidence, I'll put it that way. I have no absolute evidence that they actually have a mind. And yet, I have never encountered a person and thought to myself, this individual doesn't have a mind. I may not agree with them. I might think that their mind needs a little bit of work, but I've never met somebody where I thought to myself, oh, okay, this person doesn't actually have a mind. So based on that idea that we can know, that I can know that I have a mind, and you can know that you have a mind, but you can't know for certain that I have a mind. The best evidence, according to Turing, what he suggested was that the absolute best evidence for a mind is exactly what convinces all of us when we're dealing with humans that they have a mind, and that basically is conversation. For Turing and the Turing test, the sufficient condition was ability to engage in a conversation. And he'll give you, I'll give you some more technical requirements for that. But that idea of we talk to other individuals and that's how we assume that they have minds. Turing said we owe it basically to machines to think of them in the same ways. And if we're willing to grant that benefit of the doubt to other humans where we don't know if they have a mind, but we're willing to say yes because we can engage in conversations with them, then we owe it to machines to do that same criteria and use that same criteria. So let me give you an example. If you're not convinced yet, if you haven't bought into this of whether conversation really is the best evidence, let's consider this scenario here. Let's say that you're a veterinarian and you get called to a farm and the farmer wants you to inspect their cows. And you're a very friendly veterinarian and you like to talk to the animals. And you go up there and you say, hello there, Mr. Cow. And I'm just realizing it wouldn't be Mr. Cow. But anyways, it's not a very good veterinarian. So you go up there and you say, hello, Mr. Cow. And the cow goes, moo. Would you say that that cow has mentality at a human level? No. So in this case, you would say, all right, no mentality. Maybe the cow has a mind, but it's definitely not like our human minds. On the other hand, let's say that you go up to that cow and you say, hello there, Mr. Cow. And the cow says, hi, Mr. Scientist. And you are absolutely floored. And you think to yourself, oh my goodness, what a discovery. I didn't know cows could speak. And the cow says, hello, Mr. Scientist. And you say, can you say anything else? And the cow says, hi, Mr. Scientist. And that's all the cow ever says. Would you at that point be willing to say that this cow had something like a human mind? All right. Now, that being said, amazing cow, right? Like you could take this on the road and make yourself a lot of money, and many people would want to see this. But again, we would kind of say, you know what? No mentality here. That cow doesn't have a mind. All right. Third scenario. You walk up there and you say, hello there, Mr. Cow. And the cow says, hi, Mr. Scientist. And you say, I didn't know cows could speak. And the cow says, well, I'm a cow and I can speak. And you say, this is utterly fantastic. And the cow says, we can't be friends. So given this evidence, how many would be willing to say, you know what, that cow has a mind? Hands? Well, at the very, you'd be on the way to saying that that cow has a mind, and you'd be much more willing to say it for that cow than for any other cows. And there's something about being able to engage in conversation that is convincing that they have a mind. And again, Turing realized that that is the basis upon which we grant other human beings the benefit of the doubt that they have a mind. So that if we want to be fair, if you want to use that term, in judging other minds, then we should give the same criterion and use that 5-minute, that conversation threshold as the threshold for agreeing that other people have a mind. So, yep.
What is that to say about disabled people whose communication is
So that is a really good point. So the question was, what does this say about people with, let's just broad term, language impairments? What does it say about people with language impairments? We will get to that, I promise, because that is a big point to make, and it's something that we need to make sure that we get very clear before I let you out of this class. And anybody with a language impairment, you're like, well, they don't have a mind. Dr. Yudicevich told me so. So you're absolutely right. And we'll get to why you're right in a few minutes. All right, so we would be more willing to grant this cow the benefit of the doubt that this cow actually has a mind. So this brings us to the formalization now of the Turing test. So the Turing test, and this is what Alan Turing proposed, it's framed as an imitation game. And what you do is you have one room, and in that room, you put your artificial intelligence. And then you have another room, and in that room, you put a human being. And outside of those two rooms, you have a judge. And the judge does not know which room has the machine and which room has the human being. And the challenge for the judge is to figure out which room has the human being. And the way that it does that, or the way that the judge does that, is by asking or sending questions to each room. So originally, in the original formulation of this, it was text questions, because voice synthesis was so far off into the future that it was, you basically send a message to one room and you basically send a message to another room. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to ask questions. You're basically trying to engage in conversation, trying to figure out which room has the human being. So you might start off with something like, what is the capital of France? And the artificial intelligence might answer Paris, and the human might answer Paris. So in that case, you have no information. Room A might be the human, room B might be the human. You have no way of knowing. So you keep asking questions and you keep asking questions. And you might at one point ask the following question. You're in the desert, walking along the sand, when all of a sudden you look down and see a tortoise. It's crawling towards you. You flip the tortoise over on its back. Why is that? And the artificial intelligence might say, because you told me to. And the human might say, why would I do that? That's cruel. I'd flip it back over. And if you were looking for artificial intelligence or replicants, this is actually one of the questions that you would use. But again, you would just continue to ask questions until you thought you would have enough information to determine where the human is. And if the guess that you made was at chance levels, then Turing basically said that if the guesses are at chance levels, then the computer has passed the criteria for being a human. It has shown human level conversation to the point where you could not distinguish that conversation from another actual human. So that other actual human provided the baseline for how good the conversation has to be, and your artificial intelligence met that criteria if you still have no idea after a prolonged conversation which room houses the AI and which room houses the human. So if the questionnaire identifies a room with humans in it at chance levels, then Turing would say that we would conclude that the computer actually does have a mind. And we would do this because we would be giving it, that computer, we would be giving it the same benefit of the doubt that we give other people, that they also have minds. So according to Turing, passing the Turing test is a sufficient condition for mentality. And this is the point where I want to make it very, very clear. It is a sufficient condition for mentality. That is to say that it's enough. That if you can do the Turing test, if you can pass the Turing test, then people, according to Alan Turing, cannot ask you to do any more to prove that you have a mind. It's sufficient. It's enough. You've passed the criteria. You've made it to the point where we owe you the benefit of the doubt that you actually do have a mind. But we've already touched on this a little bit. Is it necessary? And we've already kind of alluded to the fact that it's not necessary. And I want you to kind of think now of things that have a mind that wouldn't pass the Turing test. So the one that was already suggested would be people with language impairment. So if you have somebody with language impairment, then you put them in one room, you put a typical human being in another room, you would know very very easily, very soon, which one of them, which room housed the typical performing human. So people with language impairments would fail the Turing test. But I don't think any of us would be comfortable with saying, well, somebody with a language impairment, they don't have a mind. So again, this is the clear distinction we need to make. Passing the Turing test is enough to say that you have a mind. Failing the Turing test is not enough to say that you don't have a mind. So it's a sufficient condition, but it's not necessarily necessary. Yep. Well, yeah, I mean, when you start getting into the kind of philosophical questions that have been sort of plaguing AI researchers, or not plaguing AI, but have now been on the minds of AI researchers, you get to those types of questions. Like, would a super intelligent AI that did not want to be identified as generally intelligent, would they fail the Turing test on purpose? Right. So, and the answer is it's quite possible. It is extremely possible. So I can't remember the researcher that proved what I'm about to tell you. I'll try to look it up and see if I can bring it to the next class. But when they were talking about how to proceed with AI safely, and they thought to themselves, well, we'll just make a closed system, right? We'll develop an AI, but we won't hook it up to the internet. We won't hook it up to Wi-Fi. We'll have it in some sort of Faraday cage. We'll just keep it in a completely closed system. So it doesn't matter how intelligent it is, it's going to be stuck in a room, right? And it's only going to have access to the information that we want it to have access to. So even if it gains super intelligence, it's stuck in a room. What could it possibly do? This AI researcher proved, and I haven't seen his proof, so I can't talk to it too much, but proved that that super intelligence would basically eventually be able to convince somebody to let them out. And if you've ever seen the movie Ex Machina, that's basically the premise of that movie. So he proved that you can take all the safeguards you want. An intelligence that is good enough will eventually be able to find a way out and basically convince you to let it out. So yeah, I mean, it is quite possible that the Turing test needs to be reformulated in a way, because I would say for a lot of the large language models that they have now, if you put one in a room, if you put a large language model in a room and you put a typical human being in the other room, you would probably be able to tell them apart, not because a large language model is failing, but because it performs so much better than the typical human. So after a conversation, you'd probably say to yourself, yeah, that one over there, it's too smart. That's gotta be, a computer. But yeah, so I mean, it's one of these things where it's moving so fast and there's so many interesting possibilities that would occur. But again, something that's 80 years old kind of foresaw this eventually coming to pass. So any other kind of suggestions on things that have a mind that wouldn't pass the Turing test? Okay, so we had people, oh yeah, kids. So children wouldn't pass the Turing test, and yet we would not be comfortable saying children don't have minds. So again, just to drive it home, not a sufficient, I mean, it's a sufficient condition for mentality. But just because you fail the Turing test doesn't mean that you get to deny that somebody has a mind, to deny that they have mentality. So depending upon how comfortable you are granting mind status to other things, you might say to yourself, well, that assumption that I made earlier with the cow example, where I said, well, the cow has no mentality, I would argue, and you could ask animal psychologists, that animals also have a mind, right? So they seem to be aware, they have autonomy, they have wants, and they have emotions, right? Or at least it's very convincing that they do. I talked about Rene Descartes before. He adamantly denied that animals are anything more than just reflexes. But I would say that a dog has a mind, and a dog has no chance of passing the Turing test. And we were just the example of children just came by. Children have very limited language abilities up until I would say at least 7 years old. I'm not a linguist, or a developmental psychologist, so I wouldn't know the exact dates. But up until that time, they don't have language abilities equal to that of an adult, and definitely don't have knowledge equal to that of an adult until way later. So we have children, and then also people with language impairments. So people on the autistic spectrum oftentimes have very different language abilities that would be incredibly easy to detect in a Turing test. They would fail the Turing test very often. However, none of those examples, I would say, would be anything where I would deny that that person has a mind. And we as a society also have come to a point where we would not deny that those individuals have minds. So keep that in mind whenever tests of mentality are being used. They're always sufficient conditions. You go above that and you have a mind for sure, but they're not necessary conditions, meaning that if you go below it, that does not mean that you don't have a mind. All right, so any other comments before we leave our look at AI, before one last little cautionary note? All right, so the last thing that I wanted to bring up, and this is something that happens over and over and over again in science, and it's not soccer, it's called moving the goalposts. So moving the goalposts is a metaphor that means when a rule or a criterion or some sort of goal is changed in the process of the competition. And it's changed while that competition is in progress in such a way that the new goal, you've moved the goalposts, the new goal offers a benefit or a disadvantage to one side and an advantage to the other side. So this is a move that is often used, or has been often used. I'll go back to my present sense, is often used in science. So I'll give you a nice historical example of this. This comes from Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he's going to be talking about Neanderthals and research that has been done on Neanderthals, and then also on anthropology and the history of anthropology. And he gives a very nice example of moving goalposts in anthropology.
Old timers, we grew up. If you called someone Neanderthal, that was an insult. Like they're still evolving Neanderthal, and they all went extinct anyway. Do you realize that the most racist scientific community ever were 19th century anthropologists? They're the ones that set up the race and the this, and white male humans were at the top of the evolutionary ladder, and blacks and everybody else were lower, still evolving, closer to the apes, and all of this. This was going on for coming out of the 18th century into the 19th century. My point is, in the 1990s, now that we can do genetic tracking and things,
Okay.
now we do genetic tracking,
Yeah.
the world found out that Europeans are between 1% and 3% Neanderthal genetically, and Africans are 0% Neanderthal. So in the 1990s,
Yes.
research papers started coming out talking about how creative and imaginative the Neanderthals must have been and how they used tools. A complete facelift of the Neanderthal that started at the time they learned this.
Okay, so that's a historical example of moving the goalposts. So Neanderthals were considered subhuman. They were considered not as intelligent as current Homo sapiens. And if you were closer, according to the 18th century anthropologists, the closer your lineage was to Neanderthals, the less intelligent you were today, the less cultured you were today, the less developed you were today, because of that closeness to Neanderthals, because Neanderthals were not as intelligent as Homo sapiens. Then, when it was found through genetic testing that Europeans were about 1% to 3% similar to Neanderthals, then all of a sudden the goalposts moved. And Neanderthals were no longer unintelligent, but now they were highly creative. Now they were highly imaginative. Now they had tool use. So again, this was a nice example of that idea of moving the goalpost. Hey, it's how close are you to Neanderthals determines whether or not you're intelligent. Oh, wait, I'm super close to Neanderthals? Well, let's move that goalpost over here. Neanderthals were actually pretty intelligent. They did a lot of really cool things. So that historically happens, and that is actually happening and has been happening for decades when it comes to artificial intelligence. So especially with ChatGPT, when we were talking about the Turing test, and we were talking about it as an imitation game where you would simply ask individuals whether or not, different questions, without a doubt, the ChatGPT can pass the Turing test. And I'll give you an example of just a real life example of just how clear it is that it can pass the Turing test.
At the end of last year came ChatGPT from a company called OpenAI. It is a program that can take a prompt and generate human-sounding writing in just about any format and style. It is a striking capability that multiple reporters have used to insert the same shocking twist in their report.
What you just heard me reading wasn't written by me. It was written by artificial intelligence, ChatGPT.
ChatGPT wrote everything I just said.
That was news copy. I asked ChatGPT to write.
Remember what I said earlier? But ChatGPT I asked ChatGPT to write that line for me. Users who are. Then I asked for a knock-knock joke. Knock-knock. Who's there? ChatGPT. ChatGPT who? ChatGPT careful. You might not know how it works.
Yep, they sure do love that game. While it may seem unwise to demonstrate a technology that could well make you obsolete, I will say, knock-knock jokes should have always been part of breaking news. Knock-knock. Who's there? Not the Hindenburg, that's for sure. 36 dead in New Jersey.
Okay, so John Oliver mentions that game that they like to play. That game that they were playing was the Turing test, right? They were basically reading conversational English, and then at the end of it, they told their audience, "Oh, that was actually written by a machine. I got you." And basically, if you thought to yourself, "Oh my goodness, that was written by a machine," then you, just as a judge, failed to choose what was human and what was machine, right? It was delivered by a human, but you failed to notice that it was written and thought of and created by a machine. Those were literally examples on screen of people failing, computers passing the Turing test. So what happened very recently, and again, this happened with every advancement in computers and technology, is that human beings get uncomfortable and we start moving goalposts. So this was out a couple of years ago. Once ChatGPT started passing the Turing test and it started really looking like human cognition and human behavior, articles like, what kind of mind does ChatGPT have? And this was in the New Yorker. And I'll just read a couple of excerpts from this. So in this article, the author says, ChatGPT produces something that sounds like how a real person would talk about these topics. A system like ChatGPT doesn't create, it imitates. It instead copies, manipulates, and parses together text that already exists, originally written by human intelligences. So this is kind of the pushback, the moving of the goalposts, because now that ChatGPT has passed the Turing test, people are now way less willing to accept the Turing test as a sufficient condition for mentality. So now that the Turing test would say, yeah, we got to grant ChatGPT mentality or grant it the assumption that it has a mind, now people are pushing back and saying, well, no. It just imitates. It's not actually thinking. And if you want to do thinking, you need to do something different. So this is something, if you look at the history of it, that has occurred since like the 50s. So when the Turing test originally came out in the 50s, it was mostly hypothetical. Machines couldn't hold real conversations at that time. So critics didn't really feel a lot of pressure to attack the experiment or attack the idea of the Turing test. They thought it was a clever thought experiment. They thought it was a long-term challenge, not an immediate threat. So they were okay with granting Turing the more acceptance of this particular idea. But as computers improved in the 70s, in the 80s. And symbolic artificial intelligence, natural language programs started doing surprisingly well. Then all of a sudden, a lot of pushback started coming against the Turing test. So this is where arguments started where, it's just symbol manipulation. It's not actually intelligence. There's no understanding. There's no intentionality. And critiques like John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment occurred during that time. And then surprisingly, the better the machines actually got, the narrower the definition of intelligence became. And I just want to be very clear, this is not a criticism of definitions of intelligence, because to say that we had intelligence all figured out and what a mind is all figured out back in the 40s would be ludicrous. It would be a ludicrous statement. We still don't know exactly what intelligence is. We still don't know exactly what a mind is. But it's very important, it's very instructive to know that these types of unscientific approaches exist and to be aware of them, to be aware when people start moving those goalposts. So as soon as computers started getting close to passing that Turing test, that's when individuals and critics started saying, well, you know what? It's passing the Turing test, but it doesn't really count. And we're going to shift from behavior to some sort of analysis of internal states. And we're going to shift from performance to a machine actually has to have consciousness. And we're going to shift from competence in what they're doing to some sort of subjective experience. And there is actually a phenomenon related to this called the AI effect, where as soon as the quote is, as soon as we know how it works, it stops being intelligence. So as soon as we can figure out exactly how it works, then it stops being intelligence. And the acceptance of the Turing test kind of suffered as a result of this effect. So you'll notice this, and I mean, it kind of drives us to be more clear about what intelligence is. So intelligence might, at the very least, require autonomy. It might require wants. It might require emotions. Those things might be what a mind actually is. And this sort of refinement of that is something that science is supposed to do. But oftentimes it does not do that for the correct reasons. And many oftentimes, I'm failing my own Turing test. Many of the times when people who have a privileged position start to feel the pressure of that privileged position no longer being theirs, that's when the pushback occurs. So when Europeans felt their privileged position being threatened because now they're Neanderthals, they're 3%, 1% to 3% Neanderthal, that's when the Neanderthals all of a sudden were this highly intelligent, highly imaginative race that used tools. As soon as computers started competing with humans for maybe having a mind, that's when humans started saying, well, you know what, it does this thing, it passes the Turing test, but now it's got to do this. I'm going to move the goalpost over here. And, oh, it can do this now? Well, now it's got to do this. I'm going to move it over here. And, oh, it can do this now? Well, now I'm going to move it over here. And it really is just something to be aware of, this phenomenon of the moving goalpost, because you never want to move the goalpost for those reasons, to just protect the status quo. If you need to move the criterion, make sure that it is for a good theoretical reason, such as a new understanding of what the mind is. So for example, when we talk about embedded and embodied cognition, that's a good place to say, well, no. A mind actually needs to be embodied in something physical, and it needs to be embedded in an environment. And to the extent that machines are not, then they can't have a mind. That's completely justifiable, but don't allow things to just get added on because we start getting uncomfortable thinking that, well, maybe these machines should actually be granted the status of having minds. All right, so any other thoughts about that? Comments before we move on? All right. So now we're going to switch from representation and AI, and we are going to switch our attention to attention. All right. And So what we're going to do now for the rest of today is we're going to start taking a look at the basics of attention. And hopefully we'll make it in this class, because if we get there in this class, you are going to miss something obvious. And you're going to feel your own attention system betray you. And as we're going to see, that's the actual point. The point is that your attention betrays you and fails on you in the correct way. So leave that hanging where it is. What we're going to do for the rest of this meeting today, we're going to introduce what attention is. We'll make sure that we get that very clear right from the beginning. We'll talk about serial and parallel processing. I'll give you a couple examples of serial versus parallel processing. We're going to take a look at face perception and visual search. We're going to take a look at a couple of examples of change detection, including the mystery change detection and a test your awareness who-done-it example. And then if we can make it there, we'll end with, where does your attention actually come from? What is the source of this magical thing called attention? And we're going to see that sometimes it's stimulus driven and sometimes it's goal driven, and we'll give some examples for that. All right, so what is attention? So let's say that I asked you to take a look at this painting here of the School of Athens by Raphael. And as you look at this painting, you'll notice certain things. You'll notice that there's a lot of people there. You'll notice that there are some nice tiles. There's some nice columns. There's various statues that have been depicted. It's a very busy, very full painting. And you might think that you're attending to the entire painting and you're processing information about the entire painting. But if I start asking you about specifics, you'll notice that your processing of this painting isn't done. So if I tell you that Raphael was a student of Leonardo da Vinci, and because of that, he liked to insert Leonardo da Vinci into some of his paintings, and I said, there's a picture of Leonardo, where is he in this painting? All of a sudden, this painting that you were looking at and processing, you now have to focus your attention and probably go person by person by person until you see this person here and realize that, oh, okay, that guy matches the face. That one looks like Leonardo. That is the one that Raphael put in there. And if I continue and say, well, hey, if you're a fan of 1990s hard rock and you know Guns N' Roses, then you probably know that they released a double album called Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. That image is actually from Raphael's School of Athens. So where in that painting is that particular image? Again, right now, you're probably scanning across multiple of the individuals, and you'll go person by person by person until you find that little image right there. And when you put them side by side, you can see that it's the same image that they used for their cover. So this was a couple of examples right now of attention. Attention is, we'll talk about this if we get there today. Attention is one of the most precious resources that we have in our society today. So you might have heard of things called the attention economy and how everybody is trying to vie for your attention. Everybody's trying to grab a piece of your attention because there's just so much content out there. So when you actually hear the phrase, oh, I need to pay attention, you are actually paying a resource that you have a limited amount of into a particular goal. So if you are somebody that loves movie Easter eggs, you will pay attention to every little subtle detail in a movie until you find all the Easter eggs that are in there. So in this article by Olivia Trufant-Wong, all the details in the Spider-Man Far From Home trailer you totally missed, from Easter eggs to endgame clues. They noticed that on the passport for Peter Parker, there is no year on his passport. So they probably went frame by frame and found out that there actually isn't a year. There's supposed to be, but there is no year on that passport because they didn't want to date the film and they didn't want to date how old Peter Parker is exactly in this. But that is something that you, if you saw this film, probably didn't notice unless you were specifically looking for these details, these little things, unless you were paying attention. So we've established that we need attention to process. We established that attention is a limited resource. So let's get going with some definitions here. So attention is defined as the ability to focus on specific stimuli or in specific locations. So again, that ability to focus on a specific part of that picture or in a specific place in that picture, that is what attention, that is the ability that attention allows you to do. And then when you're focusing, what that basically means is that you are then processing the information that has been selected by that focus. So you focus in on a stimuli, you focus in on a location, and then you process the information in that stimuli or in that location at the expense of everything else that is not that stimuli or not that location. And this has to happen. Look, this has to happen when there is more information than can be processed. So there is a lot of information in the School of Athens. It's impossible for our visual system and our cognitive system to process all of it immediately. So we need to focus in on certain things depending upon what the stimuli is or what the location is, what grabs our attention, or maybe even what our goal is. So this processing that we do of the information, there's two major types of processing of information. There's parallel processing, and parallel processing is where multiple units of information can be processed at a single time. So you can process multiple units of information at the same time, and you can contrast this with what is known as serial processing. And this is where you can only process one unit of information at a time. So I'll give you a kind of visual schematic example of this. So let's say that we have an attention processor and it's a parallel processor. So that gray rectangle in there, that's a parallel processor, and information units come in on the left, get processed by the parallel processor, and then get spit out on the right after being changed somehow. And we have information units, and those are going to be represented by these spheres here. So each of those spheres is a single unit of information that this parallel processor is going to try to process. And this parallel processor has 4 channels with which to process this information. It's got the blue channel, the red channel, the green channel, and the purple channel. And there is a stream of information that is coming into the parallel processor. So we have 4 units, and then behind that we got 4 more, and then behind that we got 4 more, and then behind that we got 4 more. So we got 16 units of information that are coming towards this parallel processor. And what this parallel processor is able to do, and this is what makes it a parallel processor, is that it's able to process across all 4 channels at the same time. It can process these things in parallel at the same time. So once those first 4 units of information come in contact with the parallel processor, it can process all 4 at the same time. So it processes them and they get sent out the other side. The next 4 units of information get processed, they get sent out the other side. The next 4 units of information get processed, they get sent out the other side. And then the final 4 units of information get processed, they get sent out the other side. So we have processed all 16 units of information with this parallel processor. So that's a parallel processor. Next, we're going to take a look at a serial processor. That joke was better than that reaction. All right, next we're going to take a look at a serial processor. Same 4 channels, blue channel, red channel, green channel, purple channel. Same 4 channels going out. And now we have the same amount of information, the same units of information. So we got 4 spheres, we got another 4 spheres, we got another 4 spheres. We have another 4 coming in for a total of 16. But what makes a serial processor is the fact that it can only process across one channel at a time. So when those units of information come into contact with the serial processor, it chooses one of those channels and says, I'm going to process the information along this channel. Everything else is going to have to wait. So it takes in the blue information and processes all 4 of them. And then it switches to the red channel, takes in the red information, processes all 4 units. And those blue units are going off somewhere else in your mind to be processed some more. But those red units are getting processed. And then once they're done processing, then the serial processor chooses, for example, the green channel, and they get processed. And then finally, when those are done, the serial processor can choose the purple channel, and those final units of information get processed. So those are the 2 types of processors, parallel processors and serial processing. And as you can see in this very schematic example, parallel processing requires very few steps in order to process all of the information that is impacting that processor. So if we take a look at how many steps we needed to process 16 units of information, we can see that even if we allow for the units approaching the processor to be some of the steps, there's very few steps that was required to process all 16 units of information on a parallel processor. Compare that to a serial processor, and you require many steps. So this was the number of steps that was required to process those 16 units of information with a serial processor. Again, compare that to a parallel processor, very few steps, very quick processing. Serial processor, many steps, which means that you have many seconds, a much longer time in order to process that information. All right, any questions or comments on parallel versus serial processors? All right, well, you have both of those in your mind. So let's take a look at some examples of parallel and serial processing. So we're going to start off with face perception. And I'm going to show you an image on the next slide. And what I would like you to do is put your hand up as soon as you know which one of the faces is weird. So I'm going to put up 2 faces. One of them is weird. One of them is not weird. And what I'd like you to do is raise your hand as soon as you determine whether the left face is weird or whether the right face is weird. All right, so everybody know the task? All right. Okay, so we finally have everybody. And it took about 6 seconds to do. So which face is the weird face? Don't say why, but which one is it? Yep. It's the one on the right. So if you thought the one on the right was the weird face, you are correct. Okay, we're going to try this again. I'll put up faces on the screen. As soon as you see the weird face, as soon as you know which one it is, raise your hand. Everybody ready? Okay, so that's everybody, and it was almost instant, right? This took about 5-6 seconds for everybody to figure it out. This was under a second. Basically, you couldn't lift your arm fast enough to indicate that you figured out which face is the weird face. This is an example of parallel and serial processing. So when these faces were upside down, let's start with the upside down example. What your strategy probably was, and we know this because it took you a long time to determine which face was the weird face. What you probably did is you probably had to go through the faces piece by piece by piece. So you took a look at the eye and you said to yourself, is that a weird eye? No, that's not really a weird eye. And you took a look at the other eye and you thought to yourself, is that a weird eye? And you thought, no, that's not really a weird eye. And you took a look at the mouth and you might say to yourself, you know, it's something a little bit weird about that mouth. It doesn't quite look like it's supposed to. And you basically took piece by piece by piece serial processing of the features of this face before you were able to say, oh yeah, it's the one on the right, that is the weird one. Contrast that with these faces here, and because you were able to answer so quickly that it was the face on the right that is the incorrect face, that is evidence that you didn't process that face piece by piece, you just processed the face. You processed all of it all at once, and that is parallel processing. So this is a good example of something that's going to come up over and over again in this course, and something that it might be difficult to accept, but it's one of the basic kind of foundations of cognitive psychology, and that is the idea that your mind is as smart as it needs to be and as dumb as it can be. All right, so your mind is as smart as it needs to be. That's the good thing. And it's as dumb as it can be. That's also a good thing. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. But with that in mind, does anybody have an idea why, when you're processing a face like this, you have a parallel processor in your mind ready to go to process faces like this, but in this situation, you have to rely on a serial processor in order to process this face. So any speculations about what might be going on? Mm-hmm.
Does it have to do with like the schemas in our mind? So when we see a face right side up,
Mm-hmm.
we're able to analyze that as a whole because we're used to looking at people's faces right side up and we know what they should look like. But then when we're looking at it upside down, it's kind of a different arrangement. So we have to process each piece because it's not in its usual orientation.
So the upside down face, that face is not in its usual orientation. So it's a novel task. But this face here is in its usual orientation, and this is something that we do every day. Okay, that's part of it. Definitely has a lot to do with it. Actually, I say that's part of it. That's a lot of it. But it's just there's slightly more to it than just every day. What else is? What else is? I don't know how I can say this. I'm showing my inexperience at actually leading really good discussions. What else is it about upright faces that is something for our cognition? Yep.
That's, I guess, how alive people are. And it'd be good to know that people are like evolutionary, making sure that people are alive.
Okay, so the statement was that that's how we know that people are alive. That's how we know evolutionarily whether we should approach somebody or stay away from somebody, right? So I don't know about all of you, but I would probably choose to approach the person on the left, and I would seriously consider not approaching the person on the right. And that evolutionarily is built in on us. So we have, those are kind of like the two major, I think, explanations for what's going on here and why we have a parallel processor. So at some point, our mind said, hey, look, it's really important to be able to process faces, right? Evolutionarily, it's important to be able to process faces. It's important to be able to recognize people, for example, to recognize, oh, this is my mom. She's probably going to give me food. Oh, this is a complete stranger. I better be careful around them. It's important to recognize emotions. This is my mom and she's really, really angry versus this is my mom and she's really, really happy. That's important information to know. And then on top of that, importance in processing faces, we also have how familiar are these. So just as an exercise, over the next week, sample how many times you come in contact with faces that are upright and how many times do you come into contact with faces that are upside down. So just in this meeting that we have today, every face that I'm looking at is a right side up face. So again, your mind knows this and it says, hey, look, processing this is important. I need to be smart. So I'm going to make myself a parallel processor that allows me to process upright faces because I need to be smart. But I'm not going to waste resources creating a parallel processor for upside down faces because I also want to be as dumb as I possibly can. So this is a nice example of us and our minds being as smart as we need to be. We have parallel processors there for the important information, but as dumb as we can be, we don't want to waste processing power and representations on things that are just not going to be that important for our survival because we just don't encounter them very, very often. All right. Next one here, visual search. So this is just another example of parallel versus serial processing. So once again, we'll do this by show of hands. So in this demonstration, what you're going to be asked to do is you're going to be asked to find the letter B. So going back to letter recognition, cognitive psychologists love themselves some letter recognition, but you're going to be asked to find the B, and it's going to be hidden among distractor P's. So I won't tell you how many, but it's going to be hidden among distractor P's. So once again, raise your hand as soon as you find the B. Everybody ready? All right. All right, that was pretty quick. These get harder. All right, that one took a little bit longer. Last one. All right, so that one took the longest. So in this case, when there was only one distractor, very, very fast. You add some more distractors, it slows you down. You add even more distractors, you get even slower. So let's try that demonstration again, but this time you're going to be asked to find the letter O, and it's going to be among distractor X's. All right, so everybody ready? We're looking for the O. Here we go. All right, really, really fast. Still really, really fast. Still really, really fast. So this is another example of parallel versus serial processing. Now, if anybody can come up with an idea of why we might have a parallel processor for O's and X's, but a serial processor for B's and P's, I would love to hear it. I have nothing on necessarily evolutionarily why that might be important, but notice that you were just as fast here as you were here, as you were here. It was almost instantaneous. And what that means is that when you were searching for that O, you were processing everything and you were able to find that O. When you were looking for B's amongst P's, you had to go letter by letter by letter by letter looking for that B, and that is serial processing. You could process one piece of information at a time. All right. So one last demonstration that we're going to have, and this one I will use to kind of leave you with another thing on your mind, and we'll pick it up in terms of a discussion afterwards. But now we're going to talk about change detection. And change detection demonstrates the need for attention to actually detect changes in our environment. So we actually need to process information, to pay attention, to process a specific stimuli or a specific location in order to see that something as important as change actually occurs. So there's two demonstrations for this, and we'll have time for both of them. And the first one is redacted, and you'll know why in just a little bit. But without further ado, follow the instructions for the awareness test, and we'll see how we do.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
All right, how many passes does the team in white make? Anybody? Yep. 13. 13. Does anybody have another number that they counted? Yep. 12. Yep. 15. Okay, so we have 13, we have 12, we have 15. Anybody notice anything weird? Yep. The gorilla? Anybody else see it? Yep, we have one other person. Anyone else? All right.
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
All right. So pretty obvious, right? It wasn't a moonwalking bear somewhere in the background, off in the distance. It wasn't an Easter egg, in a Marvel movie. It was a person that just walked out right dead center, did some breakdancing, did some moonwalking, and most of us in this room missed it. I missed it the first time that I ever saw this. Unfortunately, once you've seen it, you'll never miss the moonwalking bear again. That's just how our minds work, and we might get into that when we take a look at memory. But I'll leave you with this question to think about before the next meeting, because I do want to show you one more change detection demonstration. So the question I want you to think about is, it's related to why did we miss the bear? It's right there. And as soon as you say, hey, look for a moonwalking bear, there's your moonwalking bear. So one thing to consider is, would you have been more likely to notice the moonwalking bear if you focused on the team in black? So remember that you are asked to count the number of passes that the team in white makes rather than the team in black. And if that is the case, or based on this performance, what does this actually say about how attention works? So just in case you've already seen that one, because that's a very famous example, we got one more and then we'll head on out. So I'm going to ask you to see if the inspector's coat in this next example actually changes. So that is much like the challenge where they said count the number of passes. For this next video, try to determine if the inspector's coat changes.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
That's right, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
All right, so first question, did the inspector's coat change? All right, so everybody noticed the inspector's coat change? Okay, follow-up question. Did you notice anything else weird? So what did we see? Yep.
The bear switched with the knight.
Okay, so the knight used to be a bear. All right, so there was a change there. Anything else? Yep.
Did the outfit of the dead guy change?
The outfit of the dead guy, we have that as a possibility. Anything else? Okay, so in a room full of observers, right? We have about 10 people here today. In a room full of observers, we saw the coat, everybody got the coat, and we saw two other things that we thought was weird. So let's take a look at, we found three things. So let's take a look at how many things actually did change. 21.
Action. Clearly, somebody...
So just a spoiler alert, when I was asking if anything changed, you literally could have pointed to anything in the room.
In this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Well, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
All right. So as we leave today, just an honest kind of observation, and be honest with yourself. Probably before today, you felt like you were aware of most of the things that were happening around you. And now you've just seen that not only can a moonwalking bear walk straight through your visual field and you don't notice it, but the entire room can change, including people changing, paintings changing, decor changing, costumes changing. And we noticed, as a group, we noticed 3 out of 21 changes. So this is a question that I'm going to leave you with, and we're going to pick this up next time we meet. Is that inability to notice these changes, is that a failure of your mind, or is it a design feature? So think on that, and we'll bring that up next time. But as of that, we are done for the day.